At 75, the reality of Phil Collins is a breathtaking, agonizing paradox. In the quiet, pre-dawn shadows of 2026, the man who provided the definitive, roaring heartbeat for an entire generation sits in a sterile room, staring down at his right foot. He feels absolutely nothing. The nerves are completely, permanently dead. The ultimate master of percussion, a billionaire who sold over 150 million records and commanded global stadiums with a single strike of a drumstick, is now a fragile, aging patriarch who cannot even walk across his own bedroom without the terrifying risk of collapse. Behind the Oscars, the Grammys, and the flawless soundtracks of the 1980s lies a man who spent his life desperately trying to keep time, while his own universe violently fell out of rhythm. Behind the legend is a father who once tried to embrace his child, only to fall heavily, shattering his teeth against the cold living room tiles, forced to endure the absolute humiliation of hearing his terrified kid scream for the nanny. A husband who flew across the Atlantic Ocean to desperately patch a bleeding marriage, only to return with absolutely nothing. And a cinematic icon who lay in a Swiss ICU, listening to doctors coldly whisper about his last will and testament. How does a boy whose entire destiny was hastily packed into a cheap suitcase become the undisputed king of global pop? What is the terrifying psychological cost of discovering that the quiet walls of your childhood home hid a dark, double life? And what happens when the very instrument that saved your soul transforms into a malfunctioning, broken machine? Before we answer, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the silent king at 75, you must first know the boy trying to drum away the ghosts. The suitcase drum, the bowler hat, and the rhythms of deception. There's a deeply romanticized, fundamentally flawed illusion about the origins of musical genius. We are conditioned to believe that legendary artists are born into homes overflowing with grand pianos, classical symphonies, and an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated creative encouragement. We imagine the spark of greatness being carefully, deliberately nurtured by a wealthy, loving family. But for the men who go on to define the emotional frequency of a generation, the music is rarely a luxury. It is a defense mechanism. It is a desperate, frantic attempt to drown out the suffocating silence of an unstable house. Philip David Charles Collins was born on January 30th, 1951, in West London. He did not arrive into a world of artistic privilege. He was born into the rigid, emotionally restrained, and heavily compartmentalized reality of the post-war British middle class. To fully comprehend the intense, almost manic drive that would eventually propel Phil Collins to the absolute summit of the global music industry, you must examine the specific, meager artifacts of his childhood. In the Collins household, possessions were not glamorous. They were steeped in a tight, frugal anxiety. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who grew up in the austere, rationing-shadowed decades of the 1950s, where every single item in a house was kept until it literally fell apart, the sensory reality of Phil's childhood strikes a deeply familiar, painful chord. He remembers a specific, worn-out cricket bat. It was not a treasured, expensive family heirloom. It was just a battered piece of cheap wood, one of the pitifully few pieces of sporting equipment the family owned. Yet, it sat in the corner of the room for years, too old to be useful, but too closely tied to the family pervasive, quiet scarcity to ever be thrown away. It smelled of damp wood, old sweat, and a reluctant, claustrophobic necessity. That worn cricket bat carried a distinct, unmistakable odor of a family that was terrified of letting things go. But the defining, life-altering object of his youth arrived in the freezing winter of 1956. On Christmas morning, a 5-year-old Phil Collins eagerly tore the wrapping paper off a present, hoping for a proper, dignified professional drum kit. Instead, he found a flimsy, plastic toy. It was a crushing, silent disappointment. Recognizing the boy's desperate need for a real instrument, his two uncles went into the shed and haphazardly cobbled together a makeshift drum kit. They use a hollowed-out suitcase, stuffing it with a cheap triangle and a tambourine. They handed it to the boy. Imagine profound, staggering psychological metaphor embedded in that specific gift. The universe was handing the future king of percussion a rhythm section that was literally designed to be closed up and carried away. From the very first moment he struck a beat, his destiny was enclosed in a suitcase. He learned subconsciously that music, and perhaps love itself, was something transient, something that could be snapped shut and dragged out the door at a moment's notice. He began to play. He played to fill the quiet, tense air of the house. But as he transitioned from a boy into a young man, he was about to discover a horrifying truth that would permanently shatter the foundation of his reality. His father, Greville Collins, was an insurance agent. To the outside world and to his young son, Greville was the absolute embodiment of a predictable, buttoned-up British commuter. He wore a traditional bowler hat. He walked out the front door at the exact same time every morning, carrying his briefcase, projecting an aura of immaculate, incredibly boring respectability. But beneath the bowler hat and the tailored suit, his father was operating a vast, invisible, and highly engineered lie. Years later, Phil would uncover the devastating reality that his father had been living a complete double life. The quiet insurance agent had another existence, another set of secrets, playing out entirely in the shadows of London. When a young man discovers that the patriarch of his family, the very architect of his moral universe, is a phantom, the psychological damage is absolute. It destroys the basic, fundamental trust in human relationships. The walls of a house are supposed to protect you. One might imagine the agonizing realization echoing in his mind. But Phil learned that even the quietest, most respectable walls can hide a devastating second story. The home was not a sanctuary. It was a theater of deception. He was completely unmoored. He threw himself into his music, desperately searching for a rhythm he could actually control. By the 1970s, he had joined a progressive rock band called Genesis. He was a drummer, safely hidden behind a massive wall of cymbals and tom-toms, sitting in the back of the stage, perfectly content to let other men absorb the blinding glare of the spotlight. He believed that if he stayed in the background, if he kept the beat and maintained the tempo, his life would remain safe and predictable. He married his first wife, Andrea, in 1975. He thought he had finally built a solid, impenetrable foundation to replace the fractured, deceptive home of his childhood. But the ghosts of his past refused to stay buried. In the damp, gray autumn of 1977, the eerie, unresolved trauma of his father's double life manifested in a scene so incredibly chilling, it feels violently ripped from a gothic psychological thriller. Phil and Andrea were living in a cheap, bleak tower block apartment in the Victoria district of London, just behind the imposing, majestic walls of Buckingham Palace. The building smelled of wet concrete, boiled cabbage, and old rain. In their small, dimly lit bedroom, a terrifying, inexplicable phenomenon began to occur. Their pet boxer dog would aggressively, frantically drag the electric blanket out from underneath their bed, barking at an invisible presence. The metallic, burning scent of the heated wires filled the cold room. The air was thick with an unnatural, suffocating tension. Desperate and deeply unnerved, they invited a local psychic into the cramped apartment to cleanse the space. The psychic walked into the damp hallway, stood perfectly still in the center of the bedroom, closed her eyes, and delivered a sentence that completely froze the blood in Phil's veins. "It's not the dog," the medium whispered, staring directly at the young drummer. "It's your father. Your father is here. Your father is here." Listen to the absolute, hair-raising terror of that moment. A man trying to build a new life in a cheap London flat, suddenly confronted by the suffocating, uninvited ghost of the man who had lied to him his entire life. The phantom of the bowler hat had crossed the threshold of death to haunt his son's marriage bed. It was a terrifying omen, The foundation of his new life was already cracking. Phil tried to drown out the phantom with his drumsticks. He threw himself into international tours, spending months away from the damp apartment, traveling the globe with Genesis. But the relentless, punishing schedule of a rising rock star is a ruthless predator of intimacy. By 1979, the marriage he had desperately tried to protect was completely, violently falling apart. The silence he had run away from was seeping back under the door. Driven by an agonizing, frantic panic, the man who had always hidden in the background was about to make a desperate, incredibly vulnerable leap. He was about to pack his bags, board a transatlantic flight to the freezing rain of Vancouver, Canada, and chase a fractured illusion across the globe. He was entirely unaware that the universe was preparing to hand him a devastating, humiliating defeat that would completely shatter his heart, but miraculously, violently, give birth to the most iconic, heartbroken voice of the entire 1980s. The transatlantic beggar, the empty house, and the alchemy of pain. There is a terrifying, universally recognized psychological delusion that infects a man when he realizes his marriage is completely, irreparably disintegrating. He convinces himself that geography is the actual problem. He believes that if he can just change the scenery, if he can just escape the damp, haunted apartment of London, the suffocating pressure of his career, and the relentless noise of the world, he can magically glue the shattered pieces of his life back together. He believed that love can be salvaged by buying a plane ticket. In 1979, Phil Collins was a 30-year-old man standing in the absolute wreckage of his first marriage to Andrea Bertarelli. The relentless, grueling tours with Genesis had driven a massive, agonizing wedge between them. She had taken their 2 young children and moved across the Atlantic Ocean, seeking refuge in the cold, rain-soaked city of Vancouver, Canada. To the global public, Phil Collins was an incredibly successful, wealthy rock star. He had money. He had fame. But when a man's wife takes his children and leaves a continent, the platinum records on the wall become entirely, terrifyingly meaningless. Driven by an absolute, suffocating desperation to save the only foundation he had ever built, Phil made a decision that strips away every single ounce of the glamorous Hollywood rock star mythology. He put down his drumsticks. He told his bandmates that he was taking a hiatus, completely willing to sacrifice his monumental, skyrocketing career just to save his home. He packed his bags, boarded a transatlantic flight, and flew over 4,000 miles to Vancouver. Imagine the incredibly visceral, humiliating sensory reality of that specific journey. He was not flying first class on a triumphant world tour. He was sitting in a pressurized metal tube for hours, staring out the small, scratching window at the freezing clouds, his stomach churning with the agonizing, sickening anxiety of a man who knows he is about to beg for his life. He arrived in Canada. He stood in the freezing, relentless Pacific Northwest rain. He tried to compromise. He tried to listen. He tried to rebuild the house that had already burned to the ground. But you cannot put out a forest fire with an apology. After several grueling, deeply painful months in Vancouver, the harsh, unforgiving truth finally broke through his desperate denial. The marriage was dead. Andrea did not want him to stay. She wanted a divorce. He had flown across the world to patch a bleeding crack in his universe, and he was returning with absolutely nothing. Listen to the absolute, staggering humiliation of that defeat. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men who have swallowed their massive pride, who have driven to the night, who have stood in the freezing rain and offered every single piece of their soul to save a relationship, only to be looked in the eye and told it simply wasn't enough. Phil's transatlantic failure is a profound, universally recognized wound. It wasn't just a divorce. It was an amputation. In late 1979, Phil Collins boarded another plane and flew back to England entirely alone. He returned to a massive, beautiful house in Surrey. But a house is not a home when the closets are half empty and the children's bedrooms are completely silent. The silence in that house was absolutely deafening. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of an active crime scene. He was 28 years old, wealthy, and fundamentally, completely gutted. The ghost of his father's double life, the cheap plastic suitcase drum kit of his childhood, and the terrifying realization that everything he loved could be packed away in an instant had violently crashed back down upon his head. But a man cannot simply sit in a silent house and survive. The human brain, when subjected to that level of concentrated, agonizing despair, demands a pressure valve. If it cannot find one, it will turn to the bottom of a bottle, or it will simply collapse. Phil Collins did not turn to the bottle. He turned to the basement. He went down into the dark, cold studio beneath his empty house. He sat behind his drum kit. But for the very first time in his life, hiding behind the cymbals was no longer enough. The boy who had spent his entire existence sitting in the back of the stage, keeping the rhythm for other men, suddenly realized that the drums could not articulate the sheer, blinding rage and profound, weeping sorrow that was tearing his chest apart. He needed a voice. He walked up to a microphone, plugged in a cheap, simple drum machine, and he began to sing. He didn't sing the complex, mythological, progressive rock lyrics that Genesis was famous for. He didn't sing about imaginary worlds. He sang directly into the void of his own living room. He sang about the freezing rain in Vancouver. He sang about the betrayal. He sang about the agonizing, physical pain of waiting for a phone call that was never going to come. In the dark, echoing solitude of that basement, surrounded by the ghost of his ruined marriage, Phil Collins performed the absolute greatest, most legendary act of artistic alchemy in the history of the 1980s. He wrote a song called "In the Air Tonight." "I can feel it coming in the air tonight, oh Lord," he sang, his voice dripping with an incredibly dark, cynical, and dangerously quiet menace. "And I've been waiting for this moment for all my life." And then, at the exact, terrifying climax of the song, Phil Collins unleashed an explosive, earth-shattering, and completely revolutionary drum fill. Boom, 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 crash. It was not just a drum beat. It was a sound of man completely, violently breaking out his cage. It was a sound of a heart shattering against the cold floor tiles of a massive, empty house. It was a primal, agonizing scream directed straight at the woman who had let him drown in Canada. When "In the Air Tonight" was released in 1981, the global music industry was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable gravity of the track. It didn't sound like anything else on the radio. It was dark. It was atmospheric. The gated reverb drum sound, a heavy, compressed, and terrifyingly massive crack that snapped like a gunshot, completely redefined the entire sonic landscape of the 1980s. The song skyrocketed up the international charts. The quiet, balding, profoundly ordinary-looking drummer in the back of the band had suddenly, violently kicked the front door wide open. Phil Collins stepped up to the front of the stage and became one of the most dominant, inescapable, and unbelievably wealthy solo artists on the entire planet. He took the unbearable, humiliating rejection of his divorce, and he mathematically transformed it into multi-platinum records, Grammy Awards, and completely sold-out stadiums across the globe. He became the undisputed voice of the decade. He was a soundtrack for every broken heart, every late-night drive, and every cinematic montage of the era. He had won the ultimate, magnificent victory. He had taken his pain and monetized it into absolute, towering immortality. But fame, especially the suffocating, relentless, 24-hour-a-day omnipresence that Phil Collins achieved in the 1980s, is a highly radioactive commodity. It burns incredibly bright, but it systematically destroys the very foundation of the man holding it. As he transitioned from the 1980s into the massively lucrative 1990s, Phil Collins was about to discover a terrifying, undeniable truth. He had successfully sung his way out of the basement, and he had completely conquered the globe. He had married his second wife, Jill Tavelman, and welcomed a beautiful daughter, Lily. He thought he had finally built an impenetrable fortress. But the universe, operating with an incredibly patient, malicious memory, was merely waiting for the king to become comfortable. The man who had spent a decade singing about heartbreak was entirely unaware that the most spectacular, highly publicized, and deeply humiliating scandal of his entire existence was quietly waiting in the fax machine. The golden armor he had built was about to be completely, violently ripped away, and the very voice that had made him a billionaire was about to become the target of a vicious, merciless global backlash that would force him to confront the absolute darkest, most terrifying demons of his own making. The omnipresent God, the avoidant boy, and the scream of the fax machine. There's a profoundly dangerous, almost toxic radiation that emits from achieving total, absolute cultural dominance. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Phil Collins was not just a successful musician. He was an inescapable global phenomenon. He was the undisputed king of the radio, the MTV pioneer, and the soundtrack to billions of lives. He was literally everywhere. In 1985, during the legendary Live Aid charity concerts, he achieved a logistical miracle that permanently cemented his mythological status. He performed a full set in London, immediately boarded a Concorde jet, flew across the Atlantic Ocean, and performed a second set in Philadelphia on the exact same day. He was a man who had successfully conquered time, geography, and the entire music industry. He had married his second wife, Jill Tavelman, in 1984. They welcomed a daughter, Lily, in 1989. They lived in a spectacular, sprawling estate. He had won Grammys. He would eventually win an Academy Award for his soaring, emotional work on Disney's Tarzan. He had amassed an incredible, staggering fortune that insulated him from the freezing, damp anxieties of his youth. But behind the blinding, relentless barrage of the paparazzi flashbulbs and the multi-platinum smiles, the architecture of his soul was buckling under an unimaginable weight. To understand the catastrophic, highly publicized, and deeply humiliating implosion that was about to occur, you must strip away the billionaire rock star and look directly at the terrified, 5-year-old boy holding the plastic suitcase drum. Phil Collins was a man completely, fundamentally paralyzed by the fear of confrontation. The boy who had discovered that his father was living a secret double life. The boy who learned that the walls of home could hide terrifying truths had developed a severe, almost pathological aversion to conflict. He desperately wanted everyone to be happy. He wanted to be the nice guy. He wanted to keep the rhythm steady and avoid the explosive, messy, and agonizing reality of human anger. But when you spend your entire life frantically trying to avoid a storm, you inevitably end up building your house directly on a fault line. By the early 1990s, a relentless, exhausting schedule of global tours, recording sessions, and constant media appearances had completely consumed him. He was a workaholic, using his monumental career as a magnificent golden shield to avoid sitting quietly in his own living room. The physical and emotional distance between Phil and Jill became an unbridgeable, silent canyon. The marriage was quietly, methodically dying. But Phil, terrified of the screaming, the tears, and the brutal, face-to-face reality of dismantling a family, simply could not look his wife in the eye and pull the trigger. He avoided. He deflected. He went on tour. And then in 1994, the universe operated with an incredibly cruel, mathematically precise sense of irony, arranged for the most famous man on the planet to execute the most notorious, cowardly, and universally condemned breakup in the history of British pop culture. The media exploded with a story that instantly transformed the beloved, affable pop star into the most hated man in the United Kingdom. The headline screamed that Phil Collins had dumped his wife of 10 years, the mother of his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, by sending her a fax. A fax. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated, and profoundly humiliating brutality of that specific medium. In an era before instant text messages, the fax machine was a loud, mechanical, and entirely sterile instrument of corporate communication. It sat in the corner of an office or a hallway, screeching and grinding as it slowly printed out black and white text on cheap thermal paper. To have a definitive, heart-shattering end of a decade-long marriage delivered through buzzing, in different gears of machine is a psychological violation that defies human empathy. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who understand that the absolute bare minimum requirement of basic human decency, regardless of how painful a conversation might be, is to look the person you once loved in the eye when you break their heart. Phil's action was an unforgivable abdication of masculine responsibility. The backlash was immediate, ruthless, and absolute. The British tabloid press, always hungry for the spectacular destruction of a working-class hero who had risen too high, viciously turned on him. They labeled him a coward. They mocked his receding hairline. They weaponized his immense wealth against him, painting a picture of an arrogant, detached, and emotionally bankrupt millionaire who treated his family like disposable business contracts. The public vitriol was so intense, so overwhelmingly hostile, that it completely eclipsed his musical achievements. Years later, desperately attempting to clarify the messy, complicated reality of that specific moment, Phil offered a quote that strips away the sensationalism, revealing the agonizing, frantic panic of a man who was simply drowning in his own inability to communicate. "I never asked for a divorce by fax," Phil clarified, his voice heavy with the permanent, exhausting scars of a scandal that simply refused to die. "I had sent a fax from Frankfurt to our house in Sussex regarding access to the children. I was on tour. The press picked it up and made it something it wasn't. But I know I handled things badly. I was a coward. I ran away from a conflict. I was a coward. I ran away from a conflict." Listen to the breathtaking, agonizing honesty in that admission. He did not issue a slick PR statement. He looked at the wreckage of his own reputation and admitted the profound, ugly truth. He was not a villain executing a master plan. He was a terrified, conflict-avoidant man who had used a machine to communicate because he was absolutely paralyzed by the thought of facing the emotional devastation he had caused. But the damage was permanently etched into the cultural record. The golden armor of the 1980s was completely, violently shattered. The divorce was finalized in 1996, and it was incredibly expensive. He reportedly paid a staggering £17 million settlement. He had lost his wife. He had fractured his relationship with his young daughter, Lily, and he had become a national punchline. For a man whose entire psychological foundation relied on the applause and approval of the crowd, being universally despised was an absolute, suffocating nightmare. The applause had stopped. The arenas were full, but the love had curdled into mockery. He had successfully conquered the globe, but had entirely failed to conquer the terrified little boy living inside his own head. He had treated his marriage like the plastic suitcase drum kit of his childhood. He had snapped it shut and tried to carry it away, only to realize that he had left a bleeding, shattered family on the floor. He retreated. He married his third wife, Oriane Sevi, in 1999, desperately hoping that the third attempt would finally, miraculously provide the impenetrable, permanent sanctuary he had been searching for his entire life. They welcomed two sons, Nicholas and Matthew. He moved to a magnificent, sprawling estate in Switzerland, seeking the absolute, pristine silence of the Alps, far away from the vicious, sneering tabloids of London. He believed that he had finally outrun the noise. He believed that by stepping away from the relentless touring schedule and focusing entirely on his new young family, the universe would finally grant an exemption from any further suffering. He thought the long, dark winter of his mistakes was finally behind him. But the universe, operating with its incredibly patient, malicious memory, was merely letting the aging drummer catch his breath. The man who had spent his life running away from emotional pain was entirely unaware that an invisible, profoundly terrifying physical storm was quietly gathering inside his own skeleton. The millions of dollars, the Swiss mansion, and the third marriage were about to be violently tested. And the very instrument that had saved him from the damp apartment of London, the very hands that had built his billion-dollar empire, were about to betray him in the most catastrophic, humiliating, and agonizingly painful way imaginable. The flying drumstick, the severed nerves, and the condom metaphor. There's a majestic, deeply ingrained arrogance that accompanies physical mastery. When a human being spends 50 years obsessively, frantically training their body to perform a specific, highly complicated mechanical task, whether it's hitting a 90-mile-per-hour fastball, dancing on an international stage, or commanding a complex drum kit, they develop an absolute, unbreakable trust in their own flesh. They assume their hands will simply obey the commands of their brain forever. But biology, operated with an incredibly cold, mathematically precise cruelty, does not care about the millions of records a man has sold. It does not care about Grammys. Biology only cares about the terrifying, inevitable accumulation of wear and tear. As the new millennium progressed into the late 2000s, Phil Collins was living a deeply quiet, highly insulated life in Switzerland with his third wife, Oriane, and their 2 young sons. He was in his late 50s. The deafening, exhausting roar of the stadium tours had finally, beautifully subsided. He believed he had successfully secured a sanctuary. But the physical bill for a lifetime of relentless, manic drumming was quietly, maliciously arriving in the mail. Decades of hunching over a snare drum, thrashing his shoulders, and violently slamming his body into the cymbals had completely, systematically destroyed the delicate, intricate architecture of his upper spine. The vertebrae in his neck had crushed together. The essential, vital nerve that ran down his arms were being suffocated and pinched in a vice grip of deteriorated bone. In 2009, the chronic, radiating pain escalated from a manageable nuisance into a 5-alarm, blinding physical emergency. Phil was forced to undergo a massive, incredibly invasive surgical procedure to repair his cervical spine. The doctors had to meticulously cut into his neck, navigate the fragile network of his spinal cord, and attempt to relieve the excruciating pressure. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated terror of that specific moment. A man whose entire identity, whose entire fortune, and whose only true psychological escape mechanism since he was a 5-year-old boy relied entirely on the flawless, lightning-fast execution of his hands, willingly going to sleep on a sterile operating table, entirely unsure if he would ever play again. The surgery was technically successful. The agonizing, burning pain was somewhat relieved. But as Phil slowly awoke from the anesthesia and began the grueling, exhausting process of rehabilitation, the universe was preparing to deliver a blow so completely unthinkable, so absolutely humiliating, that it would shatter his soul far worse than any tabloid scandal ever could. Months after the surgery, desperate to reclaim the one thing that had never betrayed him, Phil walked down into his private, quiet studio. To fully comprehend the sheer, psychological apocalypse of this exact moment, you must deploy the absolute power of emotional slow motion. Strip away the billionaire rock star. You are looking at a 58-year-old man, standing alone in a silent room, reaching out to pick up a simple wooden drumstick. He closed his fingers around the wood. He raised his arm. He brought the stick down toward the snare drum with the exact same muscle memory he had utilized billions of times before. But his hand did not grip the stick. The vital, incredibly delicate neurological signals traveling from his brain simply stopped at his damaged neck. His fingers were entirely, permanently numb. As he struck the drum, the stick did not bounce back into his palm. It slipped entirely out of his hand, flying violently across the room and clattering uselessly against the wall. Phil stared at his empty hand. It was a profound, devastatingly silent amputation. He was a man who had recorded the most famous, earth-shattering drum fill in the history of the 1980s on In the Air Tonight. He was the metronomic genius of Genesis. And now, the universe had cruelly, precisely, and permanently disconnected the master from his instrument. Desperate, panicking, and absolutely refusing to accept the terrifying reality of his failing body, Phil attempted to fight the paralysis. He resorted to an incredibly primitive, humiliating workaround. He took heavy, industrial tape and literally bound the drumsticks to his hands. He strapped the wood to his flesh, frantically trying to force his deadened nerves to cooperate. But drumming is an art of supreme microscopic sensitivity. It is about the bounce. It is about feeling the exact vibration of the skin through the wood. Taping the sticks to his hands completely destroyed the magic. Reflecting on his agonizing, deeply embarrassing attempt to salvage his life's work, Phil later delivered a quote of such startling, almost aggressively vulgar self-deprecation that it exposes the absolute, bleeding core of a humiliated artist. After playing for 50 years, I had to stop, Phil confessed, his voice thick with a heavy, deeply cynical resignation. I had to tape the sticks to my hands. It was like playing the drums while wearing a condom. You couldn't feel anything. The sensitivity was completely gone. It was like playing the drums while wearing a condom. Listen to the breathtaking, vulgar tragedy of that metaphor. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have spent their entire lives mastering a trade, whether it's carpentry, painting, or simply playing the piano, only to wake up one morning and realize that arthritis or a stroke has permanently stolen their ability to feel the tools they love. Phil's incredibly crass, heartbreaking description is a moment of profound, agonizing empathy. He was not just losing a hobby. He was losing his voice. The boy who hid behind the toy Suitcase drum kit to escape his father's lies was now an old man, entirely exposed to the world, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. He officially announced his retirement from music in 2011. He stated that he wanted to be a full-time father to his 2 young boys in Switzerland. To the outside world, it looked like the graceful, dignified exit of a legendary superstar choosing family over fame. But the truth was infinitely darker. The retirement was not a choice. It was a surrender. The man who had spent his entire life running away from silence was now permanently trapped inside of it. As the calendar turned toward the early 2010s, the fragile, quiet sanctuary he had built in the Swiss Alps was about to suffer a catastrophic, entirely unforeseeable collapse. The universe, operating with an almost theatrical malice, was not satisfied with merely destroying his hands. It was quietly preparing to sever his heart. His third marriage, the beautiful, isolated refuge he had constructed with Orion, was quietly, aggressively falling apart. And the man who had lost his ability to play the drums was about to be handed a divorce that would physically separate him from the 2 young sons he had promised to protect. He was about to be left completely alone in a massive, echoing mansion in Switzerland. The sky outside the skylight was gray. And the man who could no longer feel the drumsticks was about to reach out for the only 2 companions that promised to numb the excruciating, deafening silence: a bottle of Johnny Walker and a bottle of Grey Goose. The descent into the absolute, terrifying bottom of the abyss was quietly, inevitably beginning. The gray skylight, the Swiss exile, and the chemical anesthetic. There's a profound, terrifying psychological hazard that accompanies the sudden, permanent cessation of noise. When a man has spent 40 years living inside the deafening, magnificent roar of a global stadium tour, where his entire biological rhythm is calibrated to the chaotic, high adrenaline applause of 50,000 screaming strangers, absolute silence is not a luxury. It is a lethal, suffocating vacuum. By 2011, Phil Collins had officially retired. He had surrendered his drumsticks. He had moved to a sprawling, beautiful, and incredibly isolated estate in Begnins, Switzerland, overlooking the majestic, freezing waters of Lake Geneva. He had intentionally built this sanctuary for one specific, heartbreaking reason. He wanted to be a full-time, profoundly present father to his 2 young sons, Nicholas and Matthew. He wanted to permanently erase the guilt of the transatlantic flights and the failed marriages of his past. He wanted to get it right. But destiny, operated with an incredibly cold, mathematically precise cruelty, does not respect the sanctuaries we build to protect our redemption. In 2006, his third marriage to Orion Sevi had already begun to quietly, deeply fracture. Despite their best efforts to maintain the illusion of a unified home, the emotional architecture simply could not hold. They officially divorced in 2008 in a staggering, highly publicized settlement that reportedly cost Phil over £25 million. But the financial hemorrhage was entirely irrelevant. The true, devastating cost was paid in proximity. Oren eventually relocated to Miami, Florida, taking the 2 young boys with her. Imagine the incredibly visceral, cinematic reality of Phil's existence in the immediate aftermath of that departure. The 60-year-old billionaire was standing entirely alone in the center of a massive, echoing Swiss mansion. The bedrooms that were supposed to be filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of children running down the hallways were suddenly, violently empty. The man who had spent his entire life desperately trying to keep his family in one place had finally built the perfect house, only to watch the universe pack up his children and fly them thousands of miles across the ocean. He was once again the boy with the suitcase drum kit, left behind. When the human mind is subjected to that level of concentrated, agonizing isolation, it desperately seeks a distraction. It requires a volume knob to turn down the deafening roar of its own failure. Phil Collins did not seek therapy. He did not return to the recording studio. He retreated to his living room, sank into a sofa, and looked up at the large, gray skylight built into the roof of his Swiss estate. And then he reached for a bottle. To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated psychological horror of his descent, you must strip away the clinical, sanitized term alcoholism. This was not a glamorous, rock star party. This was a slow, methodical, and profoundly depressing daily ritual of self-erasure. I'd wake up, turn the TV on, watch cricket, and pour myself a glass of wine. Phil later confessed in a rare, agonizingly honest interview, his voice stripped of all its former chart-topping swagger, revealing the exhausted, heavily scarred heart of a man who had surrendered to the void. And then it was vodka, Grey Goose, or Johnny Walker. I was just killing time. I was waiting for the boys to call, and I was staring at the gray sky. I was just killing time, and I was staring at the gray sky. Listen to the absolute, majestic tragedy buried inside that admission. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have endured the profound, chest-crushing agony of empty nest syndrome, who know exactly what it feels like to sit in a pristine, quiet house, staring at a television screen you aren't really watching, waiting for a phone call from a child that might not come. Phil's solitary vigil is an incredibly powerful, universally understood nightmare. He was not drinking to celebrate. He was purchasing a chemical anesthetic to numb the terrifying, paralyzing realization that he was entirely obsolete. The alcohol aggressively, violently accelerated the deterioration of his already failing physical body. In 2015, the chronic, radiating pain in his back and his neck reached an absolute catastrophic climax. The man who had already lost the feeling in his hands was now losing the structural integrity of his entire skeleton. The years of hunched, manic drumming had completely ruined his spine. He was forced to undergo a massive, incredibly dangerous neurological surgery. To understand the sheer, terrifying physical reality of this procedure, you must look past the sterile hospital reports. The surgeons did not just make a small incision. They had to aggressively navigate the delicate, frayed network of his sciatic nerve. Reflecting on the profound, almost grotesque violation of his own flesh, Phil delivered a quote of such startling, visceral horror that it completely strips away the dignity of the human body. They basically had to take my back apart, Phil explained, describing the grueling, invasive mechanical repair with a chilling detachment. They had to take it apart and then untangle the mess of nerves inside and put it all back together again. They had to take it apart and put it all back together again. This is not a medical description. This is a description of a broken, malfunctioning clock. The maestro of rhythm, the artist who had once possessed the most perfectly calibrated, sensitive physical instrument in the music industry, had been officially reduced to a faulty piece of machinery. His body was no longer a vessel for art. It was a construction site. And the absolute, most agonizingly cruel irony of the surgery was that it did not deliver the promised salvation. The operation severely compromised his mobility. He was issued a walking cane. The man who had sprinted across stages in front of millions was now forced to carefully, hesitantly shuffle across his own living room floor, terrified of losing his balance. His body was aggressively rebelling against him. The alcohol abuse, combined with profound neurological damage, created a perfect lethal storm. The universe, which had already stripped him of his drums and his family, was quietly preparing to humiliate him in the most degrading, physically agonizing way imaginable. He began to fall. He was navigating the quiet, lonely rooms of his house, leaning heavily on his cane, and his legs simply refused to hold him. He fell, violently snapping a bone in his foot. He underwent a grueling surgery to repair the fracture. He was placed in a heavy cast. But destiny, operating with its trademark, mathematically precise malice, was not finished punishing the drummer. Shortly after the first surgery, while still recovering, Phil lost his balance again. He crashed to the floor, re-breaking the exact same foot in a completely different place. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological devastation was infinitely worse. The repeated trauma and the severe nerve damage ultimately resulted in a terrifying, permanent condition. His right foot became entirely numb. The sensation was completely, irreversibly erased. "I don't have any feeling in it," Phil admitted, describing the chilling, ghostly reality of his own limb. "It's not that it hurts. It's just dead. I can't feel the ground. I can't feel the ground." Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological terror of that realization. For a man who had spent his entire life stomping on a bass drum pedal, demanding absolute rhythmic precision from the earth beneath him, losing the ability to feel the ground is a profound, poetic amputation of his soul. He was a ghost, haunting his own ruined body. He was completely disconnected from the earth. And as the calendar turned toward the late 2010s, the aging, fragile icon was entirely unaware that the most shameful, visually horrifying, and publicly humiliating moment of his physical collapse was quietly waiting for him in the dark. He believed he had already hit rock bottom, but the universe was about to prove that a man can always fall further. The ultimate, crushing indignity was not going to happen on a grand stage. It was going to happen in the quiet, terrifying span of a few steps between a hotel bed and a bathroom door, forcing the proud patriarch to look into the eyes of his terrified child from the lowest possible vantage point on earth. The hotel floor, the whispered will, and the suitcase closed. There's a profound, terrifying indignity in the way the human body eventually betrays us. We spend our youth believing that our sheer, unrelenting willpower can overcome any physical limitation. We command our muscles to perform, and they obey. But when the neurological architecture fundamentally breaks down, the universe forcefully reminds us that we are merely fragile tenants living inside a temporary, deteriorating house. For Phil Collins, the ultimate, agonizing realization of this physical eviction did not occur on a global stage. It did not happen in front of a flashing paparazzi camera. It happened in the suffocating, humiliating darkness of a hotel room. In June of 2017, Phil was staying in a hotel in London. It was the middle of the night. He simply needed to get out of bed and walk a few short paces to the bathroom. For a man who had spent 4 decades furiously coordinating all 4 of his limbs in a spectacular, blinding blur of percussive genius, the distance between the mattress and the bathroom door should have been nothing. But Phil was suffering from a cruel, devastating neurological condition known as drop foot. The damaged nerves in his spine had entirely disconnected from the muscles in his leg. He could not lift the front of his foot. He stood up in the dark. He took a step. His deadened foot dragged heavily against the carpet. He stumbled forward, entirely unable to deploy the basic, autonomic reflexes required to catch his own weight. He fell violently, smashing his head directly into the hard, unforgiving edge of a chair. The sharp, sudden reality of a severe laceration near his eye sent him rushing to the emergency room for stitches. He was completely defeated. The maestro who had dictated the exact, thundering rhythm of the 1980s for millions of people was utterly incapacitated by a span of carpet and a piece of hotel furniture. But the physical pain of the laceration was incredibly minor compared to the devastating, chest-crushing psychological horror that was waiting for him inside his own home. In the agonizing timeline of his physical collapse, there is one specific, incredibly intimate memory that entirely shatters the illusion of the untouchable rock star. It is a moment that exposes the absolute, bleeding vulnerability of an aging father. Phil was standing in the living room of his home, surrounded by the quiet, beautiful normality of his family. He saw his young son. Driven by the purest, most fundamental instinct of human love, Phil reached out and moved forward to embrace his boy. But the broken machinery of his body failed him again. His leg gave out. He crashed heavily, violently onto the hard living room tiles, the impact jarring his teeth. Lying there on the cold floor, struggling to command his paralyzed limbs, Phil did not feel the physical impact. What actually pierced his soul, the incredibly sharp, jagged knife that went straight into his heart, was the frantic, terrified, high-pitched voice of his own child screaming to the nanny, "Daddy's fallen over. Daddy's fallen over." Listen to the absolute, breathtaking tragedy of that specific sentence. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have always been the fiercely independent providers, the strong shoulders their families leaned on, who suddenly find themselves needing to be lifted out of a chair or helped up from the floor, Phil's silent humiliation is profoundly, painfully understood. In that agonizing fraction of a second on the living room floor, the psychological paradigm of his entire universe permanently shifted. He was no longer the invincible patriarch who held people up. He was a fragile, broken old man who needed to be lifted. The emotional devastation of this role reversal, combined with the heavy, lingering darkness of his profound isolation, drove his fragile biology directly toward the absolute edge of the abyss. The years of desperate self-medication, of staring at the gray Swiss skylight with bottles of vodka and whiskey, finally demanded their ultimate biological invoice. Phil was rushed to a hospital in Lausanne, Switzerland, suffering from a severe, catastrophic case of acute pancreatitis. His internal organs were systematically, violently shutting down. He was placed in the intensive care unit, hovering in the freezing, terrifying twilight between existence and the void. As he lay in that sterile, brightly lit room, surrounded by the rhythmic, indifferent beeping of medical machinery, the ultimate, sobering reality of his magnificent life was reduced to a single, whispered conversation. Through the heavy fog of his fading consciousness, Phil heard a doctor standing near his bed, speaking in a hushed, incredibly clinical tone to a family representative. "Are Monsieur Collins's papers in order?" the doctor whispered. He was asking if the legendary musician had prepared his last will and testament. Imagine the sheer, majestic irony of that exact moment. He had sold 150 million records. He had won Academy Awards. He had famously crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a supersonic jet to perform on 2 continents in a single day. But in the quiet, antiseptic-smelling corridors of a Swiss hospital, none of the platinum records mattered. The global icon was completely, unceremoniously reduced to a legal document. He was a signature on a page. But the universe, operated with incredibly unpredictable, beautiful sense of mercy, decided that the boy who would spend his life keeping the rhythm was not entirely out of time. Phil Collins did not cross the threshold. He survived the pancreatitis. He slowly, agonizingly crawled out of the ICU, carrying a profound, heavily scarred, and completely altered perspective on human existence. Today, in the year 2026, Phil Collins is 75 years old. To look at him now is to witness an incredibly rare, magnificent masterclass in the absolute acceptance of reality. He no longer hides the damage. When he eventually returned to the stage for his aptly named Not Dead Yet tour, and later for the final Genesis reunion, he did not attempt to project a frantic, hyperactive energy of his youth. He walked onto the stage leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He sat down in a comfortable chair, positioned directly in the center of the lights. He could not play the drums. His son, Nicholas, sat behind the massive drum kit, keeping the beat that his father's hands could no longer feel. The critics and the cynical tabloids could have easily mocked the image of a frail, seated rock star. But they didn't. The audiences wept. They did not weep out of pity. They wept out an overwhelming, profound respect. Because sitting in that chair, completely stripped of his physical prowess, Phil Collins was projecting the absolute highest, most majestic form of human bravery. He was looking at the entire world and saying, "This is who I am. I am broken. I am old, but I am still here." When we step back and look at the absolute totality of his 75 years on Earth, the breathtaking, poetic symmetry of his life comes into perfect focus. Remember the 5-year-old boy in London on Christmas morning in 1956. Remember the cheap plastic toy drum kit built inside a hollowed-out suitcase. For 70 years, Phil Collins lived his entire life like a man holding a suitcase, constantly terrified of betrayal, constantly running away from conflict, and desperately packing up his emotions to flee across the ocean at the first sign of a cracked foundation. He hid behind the cymbals because he was absolutely terrified of being seen. But as he sits quietly in his home today, surrounded by his children, leaning his frail hands on a walking cane, the 75-year-old king finally understands the ultimate truth. He doesn't need the suitcase anymore. He doesn't need to run. He doesn't need to hide his flaws behind a massive, thundering drum fill. The hands that can no longer grip a wooden stick have finally, beautifully learned how to hold on to the people he loves. The heavy, punishing rhythm of his anxiety has finally faded into the quiet, peaceful melody of acceptance. The legendary drummer has stopped keeping time for the rest of the world, and in the profound, magnificent silence of his twilight years, Phil Collins has finally, unequivocally, found his way home. As the screen fades to black on the heartbreaking, incredibly resilient and beautifully flawed journey of Phil Collins, the camera turns away from the musical legend, and it focuses gently, deeply on you. Phil's story is a profound reminder that our greatest strength is not found in remaining physically invincible. True courage is a terrifying, beautiful ability to accept our own fragility. He taught us that when our bodies inevitably fail, and we transition from the ones who protect to the ones who need protecting, our worth does not diminish. It simply changes shape. What about you? As you navigate the autumn of your own life, how did you find peace when your physical body began to demand a slower rhythm? Who were the quiet anchors that lifted you up when you felt like you were falling? Please take a moment to honor your own resilience by sharing your stories of survival, your shifting family roles, and your hard-earned peace in the comments below. Your honesty might be exactly the comfort someone else desperately needs to read today. If this deep, unfiltered look into the soul of a true survivor moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more profound stories behind the legends we love. Thank you, deeply and truly, for your time. Be kind to your own scars, cherish the quiet moments, and until next time, keep moving forward.